He was a man who owned everything: power, wealth, and an empire that stretched across continents, yet his heart was empty. Until one phone call changed everything. The night Noah Redgrave rushed to the hospital, the walls around his soul began to crack. From boardrooms and broken trust to a love reborn in the cry of newborn twins, this is the story of how a billionaire discovered that the greatest riches are not made of gold, but of love, loss, and second chances. Stay till the end. Every twist will pull at your heart. And before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 1 to 10. Subscribe now for more emotional, life-changing stories just like this. Stories that remind us all what truly matters. The elevator climbed through 47 floors of silence, the kind that hums behind your ribs and makes you hear your own heartbeat. Noah Redgrave stood inside, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the mirrored steel doors that threw his reflection at him like an accusation. The face looking back was the product of precision. Sharp jawline, hair silvering just enough to suggest authority, gray eyes that could freeze a boardroom in seconds.
He had built those eyes into weapons long ago.
They had conquered continents, signed mergers worth billions, reduced rivals to polite applause. Yet tonight they looked tired, like soldiers returning from too many battles fought for the wrong kingdom. When the elevator doors parted, a gust of sterile air greeted him. The penthouse office of Redgrave Properties stretched outward in glass and steel, a throne room without warmth. Below, the city glowed like circuitry, rivers of light pulsing through streets that never stopped moving. Noah liked watching from above. It reminded him that he owned every flicker that paid for his skyline. People looked like ants from here, small, predictable, easy to control. His assistant's voice buzzed through the intercom, calm but distant. "Sir, the Alpine Resort design team is here for the presentation." "Send them in," Noah said, eyes still on the horizon. "And remind them I'm not here for poetry." He turned as the conference doors opened. A small group entered, tablets in hand, their nervous energy trailing behind them. They spoke in corporate tones, their smiles rehearsed. Noah's gaze passed over them until it caught someone who wasn't pretending. She stood at the back, auburn hair drawn into a simple knot, posture straight, expression calm in a room built for intimidation. She didn't fidget. She didn't look at him like he was God. The presentation began. Slides flickered, glass lobbies, marble floors, chandeliers shaped like galaxies. Luxury but dead. Noah felt his patience thinning, the usual hollow ache growing louder beneath his ribs. This was what people called success, perfection polished until it lost all texture. He cut the speaker off mid-sentence. "Enough, this is generic. I could buy 1,000 like it. There's no soul here." Silence followed, the kind that makes even air hold its breath. The contractors exchanged glances, unsure whether to defend or apologize. But the woman at the back stepped forward. Her voice was calm, low, certain. "You're right. It is soulless. That's why I redesigned it." Every head turned toward her. She connected her tablet, and the wall behind them came alive. Images unfolded, warm wood grain catching morning light, fireplaces burning low, snow spilling softly outside windows that framed mountains like paintings. Her voice wove through the room like a melody made of quiet conviction. "People don't travel to feel rich, Mr. Redgrave. They travel to feel at home. To remember something gentle they've lost." For a long moment, Noah said nothing. The design stirred something unfamiliar, nostalgia maybe, or hunger. He hated that he couldn't name it. Her name tag read Clara Everett. She stood there, unflinching, eyes green as pine in winter, waiting for his verdict. He walked closer, each step measured. "Why should I trust you with a $50 million project?" "Because you're tired of beautiful things that make you feel nothing," she said simply. The words hit harder than any corporate rival ever had. Noah looked at her, really looked, and saw not defiance but truth. Honesty, unguarded and dangerous. Around them, the city lights blinked through the glass, cold stars watching a man who'd forgotten what warmth felt like. He dismissed the others. Everyone else can leave. When the room emptied, Clara stayed, still calm, still sure. Noah stood beside her renderings, the glow of her mountain resort spilling across his face. "You're confident," he said. "I believe in what I build. And if I don't, then I'll build something that changes your mind." The challenge lingered between them, electric. For the first time in years, Noah felt the steady ground beneath him tilt. Control, the one thing he worshipped, slipped through his fingers, replaced by curiosity. A dangerous kind of curiosity. She packed her tablet, thanked him for his time, and walked toward the door. As she left, Noah caught a faint trace of cedar and paint and something human that didn't belong in his world of cologne and glass. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving silence heavy as snowfall. He turned back to the windows, to the city that always bowed to him, and realized it looked different tonight, colder, smaller, a little lonelier. Somewhere in that ocean of light, a woman was walking who didn't fear him, who had just built something more valuable than all his towers combined, a crack in the armor of Noah Redgrave. Outside, thunder rolled low over the skyline, promising a storm. Inside, for the first time in a decade, he didn't look away from the dark. The city wore its winter like a mirror, cold and clean, lights bleeding across snow-slick streets that reflected the sky's gray weight. By morning, the blizzard had turned Manhattan quiet, the kind of silence that felt impossible for a place that never slept. Noah Redgrave stood by his penthouse window, coffee cooling untouched in his hand, watching flakes blur the skyline he usually commanded. He had been thinking about her since yesterday, about the woman who had stood in his boardroom and told him the truth as if she weren't afraid of it. Most people left him with numbers and handshakes. Clara Everett had left him with a question he couldn't stop hearing. Are you tired of beautiful things that make you feel nothing? By noon, the storm had sealed the city in white. His assistant called to say half the staff couldn't reach the office. He almost canceled the day's meetings until a soft buzz came through the intercom. Sir, Miss Everett requests permission to work from headquarters. Roads to her studio are closed. For reasons he didn't understand, Noah said yes before thinking. When he stepped into the conference room an hour later, the place was unrecognizable. Clara had turned it into an artist's den, sketches pinned across the walls, fabric samples fanned over the table, 2 monitors glowing with mountain light. She looked up as he entered, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose, a pencil tucked into the messy bun that now replaced yesterday's sleek perfection. I hope you don't mind the chaos, she said, smiling faintly. I think better when everything's visible. He leaned against the door frame, studying her. You could have worked from home. I could have, she said, unbothered, but I wanted to show you something. On the screen bloomed the lobby of the Alpine Resort, her version. Wood and stone and sunlight blending so naturally it looked alive. Luxury shouldn't intimidate, she said. It should exhale. Noah moved closer, close enough to smell coffee and graphite on her hands. This use feels like memory, he murmured. Like something you've already missed. That's the idea, Clara replied. You said you wanted something that lasts. I built it around that. They worked through the morning, side by side, their conversation flowing between design and laughter, statistics and small, strange silences that warmed the air. At noon, she opened a small thermos and the scent of homemade vegetable soup filled the room. When's the last time you ate something cooked by hand? She asked. I don't remember. She poured half into a second cup, sliding it toward him, then start remembering. Noah hesitated, then tasted it. The heat, the herbs, the simplicity, it disarmed him. It's good, he said quietly. My grandmother's recipe, Clara smiled. She said soup is love you can taste. Something flickered in him, an ache that was both new and old. He hadn't thought of love as something you could taste. For him, it had always been something you could lose. They ate in companionable silence while snow drifted thick against the glass. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. You ever get tired of the quiet up here? I used to think silence meant control, he said. Now it just feels like proof that I'm alone. Clara turned in her chair, meeting his gaze. There's a difference between being alone and being unreachable. Maybe you just built your walls too high. The words should have stung, but instead they landed like mercy. He looked at her and saw the stormlight reflected in her eyes, the snow still falling behind her like a different kind of curtain. Outside, the world was frozen. Inside, the air had changed. Noah realized he was smiling without meaning to, and she noticed, her lips curving in quiet victory. Hours slipped past unnoticed until evening bled into the city. When his assistant called to remind him of a rescheduled meeting, he surprised them both by saying, "Cancel it." The call ended. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Cancel everything for me, Mr. Redgrave. For today, he said, almost laughing. Apparently empires can survive one snowstorm. She gathered her papers as the light dimmed. Thank you for letting me work here. No, he said before he could stop himself. Thank you for making this place feel less like a museum. Her hand lingered on the door. Maybe next storm I'll bring soup again. And then she was gone, leaving behind warmth that outlasted her footprints in the carpet. The snow kept falling, the city glowing in soft defiance beneath its weight. For the first time in years, Noah didn't feel the pull of work or the emptiness of his view. He simply stood there, holding the half-empty cup she'd given him, realizing that somewhere between soup and silence, something inside him had started to thaw. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the city glazed in ice and light, the streets gleaming like mirrors beneath the weak sun. Noah Redgrave arrived at the office early, as he always did, but something in his rhythm was different. His steps were slower, his focus drifting, his mind still caught in the echo of yesterday's quiet. The smell of soup, the warmth of Clara's laughter, the way she'd filled that sterile conference room with something living. It clung to him like an aftertaste he couldn't shake. His assistants noticed it first. He wasn't snapping orders, wasn't scanning documents with that mechanical precision. He was simply thinking, and that was unusual for a man who had spent years avoiding his own thoughts. By late afternoon, he found himself staring at the glass wall of his office, the city sprawling below, remembering the way Clara had said, "Maybe you just built your walls too high." He didn't like the sentence, not because it was wrong, but because it was true. When evening came, he sent her a message, short, to the point. Need to review the updated design in person. Come by after 7. He reread it twice before sending, uncertain whether it was business or something else he wanted. The clock struck 7:30 before he heard the soft chime of the private elevator. Clara stepped out, her cheeks flushed from the cold, a rolled set of plans under one arm and that same calm in her eyes. "You work late," she said, her tone half observation, half question. "I live here," Noah replied, gesturing to the expanse around them. The penthouse was vast. Glass walls and minimalist furniture, art worth millions hanging in lonely silence. Clara walked in slowly, her gaze tracing the space, taking it in not as a guest but as a designer who saw what others missed. "It's beautiful," she said after a moment, "but it doesn't look like anyone actually lives here." "It's practical," he countered, crossing to the bar to pour them both a drink. "It's empty," she said softly, not as criticism but as fact. He handed her a glass, their fingers brushing, a small contact that seemed to ripple through the air. "Maybe I just don't like clutter," he said. "Or reminders," she murmured. He looked at her then, really looked, the reflection of city lights painting gold in her eyes. She wasn't challenging him. She was seeing him, and he wasn't used to being seen. "You're very direct for someone who works for me," he said, almost amused. "I don't work for you," Clara replied, meeting his gaze. "I work with you. You just don't realize the difference yet." Noah's lips curved, a rare, genuine smile ghosting across them. "You have no idea how few people talk to me like that." Maybe that's the problem. The silence between them grew soft, no longer heavy, filled with something unspoken but alive. She moved closer to the floor-to-ceiling windows, setting her drink down. "This view is stunning," she said quietly, "but it feels lonely up here, like the air's too thin to breathe." He joined her, standing close enough that their reflections merged in the glass, his sharp suit beside her soft silhouette. "I used to think height meant safety," he said. "Distance from the noise, the mess. But sometimes it just means you're too far to hear anyone call your name." She turned toward him then, her expression open, vulnerable in a way that disarmed him. "Then maybe it's time you stopped living above the world," she said. Her words lingered like the snowflakes still clinging to her coat. He didn't know what made him move. The wine, the warmth in her eyes, or the sheer exhaustion of being untouched for so long. But when he reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, she didn't pull away. The world outside was a blur of light and motion, but inside time slowed. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "Neither do I," she replied. "But maybe that's the point." He exhaled, the tension in him unraveling as if those few words had unlocked something buried. When he leaned in, it wasn't the confident move of a man used to getting what he wanted. It was the tentative reach of someone afraid to want it all. Their lips met softly, a careful promise born out of years of silence. The kiss wasn't fire. It was warmth, slow and steady, melting away everything cold that had built up inside him. When they pulled apart, Clara's forehead rested against his, breath mingling with his own. "You don't always have to be in control, Noah," she whispered. He closed his eyes, the truth of it sinking deep. For once he didn't argue. He simply stayed there, holding her in the quiet glow of the city below. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and soundless, as if the world itself was pausing to witness the moment a man who thought he couldn't feel remembered how. Morning arrived slow and golden, spilling through the tall windows of Noah's penthouse, painting streaks of warmth across the cold marble floor. The city below had already awakened to its usual frenzy, horns and footsteps echoing faintly against the glass. But inside that quiet world above it all, time moved softer. Clara was still asleep beside him, one hand resting on the sheets, her hair tumbling in loose waves across the pillow. Noah watched her for a long while, unable to stop himself. She looked nothing like the people who usually filled his orbit. She wasn't polished to perfection, wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't afraid of silence. She was real, and that frightened him in ways no business deal ever had. When she stirred awake, her eyes caught his and she smiled, that small, drowsy kind of smile that made something inside his chest unfold. "You're staring," she murmured, her voice still soft from sleep. "Trying to figure you out," he said. "Good luck with that," she teased, sitting up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "I'm not one of your projects, Noah." He smiled faintly but didn't answer. He was already thinking about the day ahead, about meetings and deadlines and decisions that waited beyond the fragile peace of this morning. It was easier to think about business than the unfamiliar weight of happiness that came with her. By noon, the illusion of calm had started to fade. They stood in the kitchen, she barefoot, making coffee while he scrolled through his phone, voice tight as he spoke to his assistant. His tone changed, colder, clipped. Clara could hear it, the shift from man to machine. When he hung up, she leaned on the counter. "You ever take a break from being in control?" "I can't afford to," he said without looking up. "You can't afford not to," she replied. He looked at her then, irritation flickering behind his eyes. "You don't understand how this works. People depend on me." "I understand perfectly," she said quietly. "You've built something so high that you can't see the ground anymore." Her words hit too close to home and he didn't answer. She moved closer, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away. A reflex born from years of keeping distance. The silence that followed wasn't soft this time. It was sharp, like glass between them. That afternoon, they drove together to the construction site of the Alpine Resort. Snow still capped the distant peaks, sunlight bouncing off the cranes and unfinished terraces. Clara spoke passionately with the engineers, her energy contagious, her vision alive. Noah watched her, torn between pride and fear that he was letting someone become too important. On the way back, they stopped at a small roadside inn for lunch. She talked about her childhood, about her mother who painted landscapes that never sold but filled their house with color. He listened, but part of him was already thinking about the next quarter's report, the investors waiting for answers. When she asked, "What do you actually want, Noah?" he hesitated. "Stability," he said. "That's not the same as peace," she whispered. He looked out the window at the falling snow, unable to meet her eyes. "Peace is expensive." That night, back at the penthouse, she packed her things quietly. He watched, not stopping her, the ache in his chest buried under pride. "You're running," she said softly, not accusing, just stating the truth. "You're afraid to need someone." He tried to speak, but the words came out hollow. "You knew what this was." She turned to face him, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. "I thought I did, but then you made me believe you wanted more." He wanted to tell her he did. That her laughter had changed the sound of his world, that her warmth had cracked his walls. But years of control were heavy chains, and he couldn't move fast enough to stop her when she walked out the door. Hours later, when the city had gone quiet again, Noah sat alone on the couch, staring at the coffee cup she'd left behind. The faint imprint of her lipstick curved against the rim. He ran his thumb over it, a ghost of a touch, and felt something inside him collapse. He poured himself another drink, though it didn't taste like anything. The snow outside fell endlessly, the world turning white and soundless. He thought of her words, "You can't afford not to let go." But letting go was something Noah Redgrave didn't know how to do. So he stayed there until morning, the city lights fading into dawn, and for the first time in years, he realized that power couldn't buy him the one thing he'd just lost, someone who had looked at him and seen a man instead of a name. The night pressed against the windows like a heavy breath, rain streaking down the glass in restless threads. Noah Redgrave sat alone in his office, the city beneath him blurring into a storm of lights. Months had passed since Clara left, but her absence still lingered like perfume that refused to fade. He told himself he'd moved on, buried himself in projects and meetings in the mechanical rhythm of money and power. But every quiet moment betrayed him. Every silence carried her voice. Every snowstorm reminded him of the soup she once shared, of warmth that no longer belonged to him. He had become a ghost in his own empire. The staff avoided his eyes. His boardroom echoed with obedience, not loyalty. The man who once commanded everything had begun to feel the hollow echo of what he'd traded for it. Even now, surrounded by the symbols of his success, Noah felt poor. The clock read 11:47 p.m. when his phone began to ring. The sound sliced through the silence, sharp and unexpected. Unknown number. He hesitated. For a strange moment, he almost didn't answer. Then instinct, or maybe fate, made him swipe across the screen. "Mr. Redgrave?" A calm, unfamiliar voice said. "This is Dr. Lopez from Manhattan General Hospital. We have a patient here, Clara Everett. She's in active labor." The world seemed to stop. Noah's breath caught. "That's impossible," he whispered. She wasn't... She listed you as her emergency contact," the doctor interrupted, her tone steady but urgent. "There are complications. She's asking for you." The words slammed through him like a pulse. The chair screeched back as he stood, already reaching for his coat. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice trembling for the first time in years. Outside, the rain was relentless, the kind that soaked through everything. Noah ran to his car, the city lights smearing past as he sped through empty streets. His hands gripped the wheel hard enough to ache. Images of Clara flashed through his mind. Her smile, her defiance, the way she had once looked at him as if he were still redeemable. By the time he reached the hospital, the world felt suspended. The air was heavy with disinfectant and quiet panic. Nurses moved swiftly through corridors of soft white light. He caught one by the arm. "Clara Everett," he said, breathless. "Where is she?" "Room 12, the nurse replied, eyes flicking to his drenched suit before hurrying away. He followed the sounds, the rush of footsteps, the muffled commands. Through the glass window he saw her, pale but fierce, hair damp with sweat, eyes locked on the doctor's. Machines beeped in urgent rhythm. Clara's body shook with exhaustion, yet her gaze was steady, unbroken. When she saw him, a faint, incredulous smile ghosted across her lips. "You came," she breathed. "I never stopped," he said, though the words barely reached her through the noise. A nurse turned to him. "We have a breech position. We need consent for an emergency C-section. She named you as proxy." His heart pounded. "Do it," he said without hesitation. "Save her. Save them." The words hung in the sterile air, trembling with the weight of everything he had never said. Time fractured. Minutes stretched into eternity. He stood outside the operating room, every sound amplified. The whir of machines, the hurried footsteps, the faint murmur of doctors speaking a language he couldn't understand. He pressed his palms to the cold glass and whispered, "Please." Then a cry, thin and sharp and alive. A second cry followed, weaker, fragile, but there. Noah froze. His eyes blurred. The doctor emerged moments later, removing her mask, her face weary but smiling. "Both babies are alive," she said softly. "A boy and a girl. They're small but strong." He didn't realize he was crying until the tears hit his collar. "Can I see them?" She led him into the recovery ward. Clara was half awake, a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead, her hand reaching weakly toward the bassinet beside her bed. Two tiny bundles lay there, breathing shallow but steady. Noah knelt beside her, his voice shaking. "Clara, they're perfect." Her eyes fluttered open, glassy but bright. "You look scared," she whispered. "I've never been so alive," he said. She smiled faintly, her hand finding his. "I told you once that home wasn't a place. It's the people who wait for you." He pressed his forehead to her knuckles. "I'm done running," he said, his voice breaking. "You were right. I built walls and now they're gone." The baby stirred softly, the girl letting out a small trembling cry. The boy following as if in echo. The sound filled the room, fragile and infinite. 2 heartbeats of new life stitching the silence back together. Noah looked at them, his children, his second chance, and something inside him changed forever. For the first time, control meant nothing. Power meant nothing. All that mattered was this moment. These cries, this woman, this fragile miracle of love surviving against every mistake he'd ever made. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. The hour the old Noah Redgrave ceased to exist, and the father began. The morning light crept through the blinds in thin silver lines, painting soft patterns across the hospital room. The storm had passed outside, but inside Noah's chest the thunder still echoed. He hadn't slept. He didn't dare to. He had spent the night sitting beside Clara's bed, one hand wrapped around hers, afraid that if he let go, the world would crumble again. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors had become his heartbeat, steady and fragile at the same time. Clara stirred, her breathing shifting, her eyelids fluttering open as the pale dawn brushed her face. She looked weaker than he remembered, her skin washed in white. But her eyes, those green eyes that had once stared him down in a boardroom, still carried that quiet strength. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He smiled faintly, exhaustion softening the hard lines of his face. "I told you I'm done running." She looked toward the small glass bassinets near the window where 2 tiny bundles slept under soft blue light. "They're real," she said, her lips trembling with disbelief. "I thought I lost everything." Noah rose from the chair and crossed to the bassinets, his movements slow, reverent. The boy slept with his tiny fist curled near his cheek, the girl slightly restless, her fingers twitching as though chasing dreams already. "The doctors say they're strong," he said quietly. "They came early, but they're fighters." Clara smiled faintly, her gaze unfocused from the medication. "Like their father." He turned back to her, shaking his head. "No, they're like you. You didn't give up even when I did." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of machines and the faint city noise beyond the windows. It wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that carries forgiveness. "I wanted to call you," she murmured. "So many times. But I didn't know what to say." "You didn't have to," he said. "You already did. When they called me last night, I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was a second chance." Clara blinked slowly, her lashes wet. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure I'd make it in time," he admitted, voice breaking. "But I would have run through fire if it meant hearing them cry." The door opened softly and a nurse entered, checking the babies, smiling at them both. "They're doing beautifully," she said, her tone gentle. "You can hold them soon once the monitors stabilize." Noah nodded, barely able to speak. When the nurse left, he sat back down, reaching for Clara's hand again. "You named them yet?" "I thought I'd wait for you," she said. "It should be something we choose together." He thought for a moment, looking at the boy first. "Eli," he said quietly. "Strong, simple. And her?" "Sophia," he said. "It means wisdom." Clara smiled, eyes glistening. "Eli and Sophia," she whispered. "Perfect." He exhaled slowly, as though he'd been holding his breath for years. "I don't know how to fix what I broke," he said. "But I'll spend my life trying." She squeezed his hand, her voice faint but sure. "Don't fix it. Just be here. That's all I ever wanted." The nurse returned moments later, holding a small swaddled bundle. "She's ready," she said, smiling as she placed the baby gently in Clara's arms. Clara looked down, her whole world collapsing into that tiny heartbeat pressed against her chest. Then she looked at Noah. "Come here," she said softly. He hesitated, unsure, afraid of breaking something so delicate. But she guided his hands, showing him how to cradle the child. The baby was impossibly small, her warmth seeping into his palms, her breathing a fragile rhythm he could feel against his skin. Noah looked down, and everything in him, every wall, every mask, fell away. "She's perfect," he whispered. Clara smiled through tears. "So are you when you stop pretending you're not human." He laughed under his breath, a sound that came from somewhere deep, somewhere he hadn't touched in years. "I don't deserve this," he said. "Maybe not," she replied softly. "But they do, and they need you to believe you do too." He looked at her then, at the woman who had turned his empire upside down, who had given him not just love, but a reason to breathe. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words escaping like truth that had been waiting too long. Clara blinked, startled. "Noah, I mean it," he said, voice low but steady. "Not tomorrow, not later. When you're ready. I don't want to build anything else without you." Her lips trembled into a quiet smile, tears spilling freely now. "You really have changed." He looked down at the baby in his arms, then back at her. "No," he said. "I'm finally becoming who I should have been all along." Outside, the first light of morning broke fully across the skyline, golden and new. The storm had left the city washed clean, its rooftops glittering with dew. Inside the quiet hospital room, Noah Redgrave, once the man who ruled over glass towers and empty rooms, sat with his family, his heart full for the first time in his life. And as Eli stirred in his crib and Sophia sighed softly in his arms, Noah knew he would never measure success in profits again, but in heartbeats. The hospital discharged them 3 days later, the sun sharp and clean against the glass towers as if the world itself had been rinsed of the storm. Noah stood by the entrance with the car door open, his movements uncharacteristically careful. He used to walk through marble lobbies and boardrooms without a thought, but now each step felt sacred, each sound too loud. In his arms, Eli slept soundly, wrapped in a white blanket that smelled faintly of Clara's perfume. Sophia rested against Clara's chest, a tiny bundle of warmth and peace. The twins' breathing was the softest sound in the world, but to Noah it was everything, proof that life still made room for miracles. He drove slower than he ever had in his life. Every bump in the road made him glance toward the back seat where Clara sat humming softly to the babies. He caught her reflection in the mirror, hair falling loose, eyes tired but luminous. There was a calm around her that he envied, the same calm she'd carried when she first walked into his office, the same calm that had disarmed him before he even knew her name. When they reached the penthouse, Noah hesitated. The place looked wrong now, too sterile, too cold, a museum for a man who had stopped living. Clara stepped inside and paused, scanning the polished marble floors and the hollow expanse of glass and chrome. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "but it doesn't belong to children." He looked at her, then around the apartment. The silence was heavy, empty of laughter, of warmth. "You're right," he said. "It never really belonged to me either." He set down Eli's carrier, then Sophia's, crouching beside them as Clara knelt next to him. They watched the twins sleep, tiny chests rising and falling, unaware of the world that had just begun to shift around them. For the first time in years, Noah didn't think about business or control or image. He thought about softness, the sound of Clara's breathing beside him, the way his daughter's hand twitched in her sleep, the faint coo from his son. Over the next weeks, life turned into something unfamiliar. His mornings no longer began with board meetings, but with the quiet chaos of bottles and lullabies. His phone buzzed with unanswered messages while he learned how to hold a baby's head without fear. Clara laughed at his clumsy attempts, her laughter carrying through the rooms like sunlight. Once, when he nearly spilled formula on his shirt, she wiped it off and kissed the spot. "You're improving," she teased. "Improving?" He repeated. "I've closed billion-dollar deals." "And yet," she said, smiling, "you can't fasten a diaper." He laughed, a real laugh, one that cracked open something deep inside him. At night, when the twins finally slept, they'd sit together near the window, the city stretched beneath them like a sea of stars. He'd hold her hand, tracing the lines of her palm, and think about how strange it felt to belong to something he couldn't own. Sometimes she'd fall asleep against his shoulder, and he'd stay awake just to listen to her breathe, afraid that moving would break the spell. But there were moments, too, when fear returned. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Noah would wake to the sound of his own heartbeat racing. The old ghosts still whispered, voices telling him that happiness was fragile, that he'd lose this the way he lost everything he ever let himself care for. One night he slipped out of bed and stood at the window, the city lights flickering below. He caught his reflection, hollow-eyed, weary, uncertain. He didn't recognize himself anymore, and for once that was both terrifying and liberating. Clara woke and found him standing there. "You're thinking too loud," she said, her voice soft behind him. He turned. "I'm thinking about how easily all this could disappear." She walked up to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Everything disappears eventually," she whispered. "That's what makes it worth holding." Her words settled in him like a seed taking root. He looked at her, really looked, hair tousled, eyes steady, wearing one of his shirts that hung too big on her frame. "You make it sound easy," he said. "It's not," she replied, resting her head on his chest. "But it's simple, just stay. That's all love ever asks." He held her then, his chin resting against her hair, the steady beat of her heart syncing with his. The world outside still turned with all its noise and ambition, but for Noah, time had narrowed to the space between her breath and his children's sighs. He realized that love wasn't a transaction to be measured or secured. It was a risk, an act of faith, a surrender. When dawn began to spill its light across the city, Clara's voice broke the silence. "We'll be okay," she said. He kissed her hair, whispering into the quiet, "We already are." And as the twins stirred from their cribs, tiny sounds filling the once empty apartment, Noah knew he would never return to the life he had before. For the first time, he wasn't the man looking down from a tower. He was part of something alive, something messy, something real. He had finally come home. The snow returned to the city a month later, soft and heavy, muffling the world in silence. Noah stood by the wide window, holding Eli against his chest while the boy's small fingers clutched his collar. Behind him, Clara hummed softly as she rocked Sophia in her arms, the sound like something out of a dream. The penthouse no longer looked like it belonged to a man who lived for numbers and deals. It had been transformed into a home. There were warm blankets draped over the couch, bottles drying by the sink, and a soft, honeyed light spilling from the lamps instead of the sterile white glare he once preferred. Noah looked around, still half disbelieving that this was his life. He'd traded boardrooms for baby laughter, profits for peace, and found himself richer than he'd ever been. There were toys scattered where contracts used to be. The scent of Clara's soup filled the air instead of imported cologne and leather. It all felt fragile, yet more real than anything his billions had ever bought. But even as joy settled into their days, Noah felt the weight of old habits pressing at the edges of his peace. Every morning, messages piled on his phone. His company needed him. Decisions were stacking, markets shifting. For the first time, he ignored them. Yet the silence of that avoidance gnawed at him. He had built an empire on precision and control, and now he was surrendering to uncertainty. The part of him that once thrived on structure began to whisper again. What if he lost everything? What if happiness made him weak? That night, after feeding the twins, Clara found him sitting alone on the balcony, the city glittering below like the surface of another world. Snowflakes clung to his hair and coat, melting into tiny silver trails. He didn't turn when she stepped outside, but he felt her presence before she spoke. "You're a million miles away," she said softly. He exhaled, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Maybe I never learned how to stop being afraid of losing everything." Clara wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, then sat beside him, close enough that their arms touched. "You spent your life building walls," she said. "Now that you have something worth protecting, you think the same walls will keep it safe." He turned to look at her, her hair catching the light from the window behind them, her eyes reflecting warmth against the night. "And what if they're the only thing keeping me from losing it all?" She shook her head. "No, Noah. They're what kept you from living it. You don't protect love with distance. You protect it by showing up every day, by being brave enough to stay when it scares you." Her words struck deep, disarming him in the quiet way she always could. He looked at her, the woman who had faced him when no one else dared, who had forgiven him when he'd given her every reason not to, and he realized that what terrified him wasn't loss. It was how much he needed her, how much of himself he'd already given away. He reached for her hand, fingers cold and trembling. "I don't know how to be that kind of brave." She smiled gently, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then start small. Be brave enough to stay in this moment." They sat in silence, watching the snow drift past the skyline. Somewhere inside, the twins stirred, their soft cries rising faintly through the quiet. Clara stood, holding out her hand. "Come on," she said. "Your empire can wait. Our children can't." Noah followed her back inside. The warmth hit him instantly, the faint glow of the nightlight, the steady rhythm of 2 tiny heartbeats filling the air. He lifted Sophia, cradling her against his chest as her small hands curled into his shirt. Her breath was soft, rhythmic, grounding. He felt the fragile weight of her, the promise in every heartbeat. Clara stood beside him with Eli, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. "I used to think I wanted a legacy," he whispered. Buildings, brands, things that would outlast me. But this, he looked at the twins, then at Clara. This is what I was meant to build. Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. Then build it with both hands. He leaned down and kissed his daughter's forehead, feeling the warmth of her skin against his lips. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next move or the next victory. He was thinking about bedtime stories, first words, birthdays, laughter. The future he'd never dared to imagine. Later, after the twins had fallen asleep, Noah sat beside Clara on the couch. The city hummed quietly below, but the noise no longer reached them. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, her hand brushing over his. You know, she murmured, I think the man who once ruled the world finally learned how to live in it. He smiled, eyes soft. I think he finally found something worth ruling with his heart instead of his name. The snow kept falling, blanketing the city in white, as if giving them a clean page to start from. Inside their quiet home, Noah Redgrave, once the coldest man in the tallest tower, held his family close and realized that love wasn't about control, it was about surrender. And in surrendering, he had finally won. Spring crept into the city slowly, brushing the skyline with light and warmth, melting the last traces of winter from the glass towers. The world outside Noah's window had begun to bloom again, but inside life had already found its rhythm. The twins were 6 months old now, their laughter echoing through the apartment like music, their tiny hands discovering the shape of everything they touched. It was chaos wrapped in joy, exhaustion tangled with wonder. Noah, once defined by schedules and control, now found beauty in unpredictability. The way Sophia's laughter arrived out of nowhere. The way Eli's tiny fingers clutched his thumb as if to remind him he was needed. Every morning began with soft light spilling across the nursery floor, and Clara's voice humming something gentle. Noah would watch her from the doorway, her hair falling loose over her shoulders as she cradled one baby while the other kicked his legs on a soft blanket. There was a peace in those moments he'd never known existed. He had spent his life chasing perfection, yet it was here. In the mess, the spilled formula, the unmade bed, the faint traces of baby powder in the air, that he finally found it. Yet peace came with its own questions. Clara noticed it in the way he paused sometimes, staring out the window too long or scrolling through his phone, reading messages he never answered. His company still moved without him, but each week the calls grew more insistent. His board demanded updates. His investors demanded presence. The empire he had built with precision was showing cracks in his absence. One evening, after the twins had fallen asleep, Clara found him sitting in the darkened living room, his laptop open, the glow of spreadsheets reflecting in his tired eyes. You said you wanted to be here, she said softly. But part of you is still there. He looked up, guilt flickering across his face. I'm trying to keep everything together. Everything doesn't mean what it used to, she replied, sitting across from him. You can't measure this, the laughter, the love, the sleepless nights in profit margins. He closed the laptop slowly, the click sounding final. You think I'm afraid to let it go? I think you already have, she said. You're just too proud to admit that you don't miss it. Her words hit deeper than she knew. For years, power had been his identity, success his armor. Without it, who was he? But when he looked at her, barefoot in one of his shirts, hair messy, eyes alive, and at the faint glow from the nursery down the hall, he realized that maybe being needed, being loved, was worth more than being admired. The next morning, Noah called an emergency meeting. His board members filled the glass-walled conference room, waiting for the commanding voice of the man who had once been untouchable. Instead, they got something else. Noah stood at the head of the table, calm, clear-eyed. I built this company to be an empire, he began, but I forgot that empires are cold. They don't hold your hand when you're lost. They don't love you back. Murmurs rippled through the room, confusion painted on every face. I'm stepping down as CEO, he said, effective immediately. The company needs someone hungry, someone who believes this is still worth conquering. I found something else to build. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Only one board member dared to ask, and what will you build instead, Mr. Redgrave? He smiled faintly. A life. When he returned home, Clara was feeding the twins on the couch, sunlight catching in her hair. She looked up when he entered, reading the truth in his face before he even spoke. You did it, she whispered. He nodded. It's over. No, she said, her smile widening, tears bright in her eyes. It's beginning. He crossed the room, kneeling beside her, kissing the top of Sophia's tiny head, then Eli's. I don't want to miss a single moment, he said. Not their first steps, not your smile. Not again. Clara reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. You won't, she said. You've already chosen. That evening, they took the twins to the park for the first time. The city was alive with color, cherry blossoms drifting through the air, laughter echoing from every direction. Clara spread a blanket on the grass while Noah sat beside her, Eli on his knee, Sophia giggling at the feel of sunlight on her face. He looked around and saw people moving through their own lives, and for the first time he didn't envy them. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. The sky turned gold as the sun dipped lower. Clara leaned against him, whispering, You look happy. I am, he said simply. For the first time, I'm not the man standing above the world. I'm the man holding it in his arms. And as the twins laughed together, two tiny voices carried into the evening light. Noah Redgrave realized that he had finally found everything he had been searching for, not in towers of glass, but in the fragile, fierce heartbeat of a family that was entirely his. The morning of the wedding dawned soft and golden over the mountains. A fine mist curled through the pines, the air carrying the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. From the terrace of the Alpine Resort, the same one Clara had once only drawn on her tablet, the world stretched endlessly, a tapestry of light, green slopes, and sky. Noah stood at the edge, watching the valley wake beneath him. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass doors behind him, and for once he didn't see the man who used to measure worth in contracts and towers. He saw a father, a lover, a man who had finally learned to stay still long enough to be happy. Inside, laughter echoed softly. Clara's voice mingled with the twin giggles of Eli and Sophia. The sound tugged at something deep inside him, something that would never tire of hearing their joy. The past few days had been a blur of quiet preparations, flowers, vows, rings, but this morning felt different, calm, certain, the kind of peace that came after surviving the storm. He turned as Clara stepped out onto the terrace, her hair pinned loosely, a few strands catching the light. She wasn't in her dress yet, just a soft robe and bare feet. But to him she was already everything. Sophia toddled beside her, clutching a handful of daisies she'd pulled from a vase, while Eli stumbled after, determined not to be outdone. They woke up at sunrise, Clara said, smiling as she lifted Sophia onto her hip. Apparently, their parents' wedding day is more exciting than breakfast. Noah reached for Eli, who immediately grabbed his tie and refused to let go. I think he's trying to accessorize me, Noah said with a soft laugh. Smart boy, Clara teased. He knows you need help. They stood like that for a long moment, the four of them framed by morning light. The world hushed except for the sound of small breaths and laughter. Noah kissed Clara's forehead, breathing in the warmth of her skin. You know, he murmured. The first time I saw this place, I thought it was just another property, another name on a list, and now, she asked, tilting her head, now it's the place where everything I ever wanted came true. Hours later, when the guests gathered on the terrace, the air shimmered with sunlight and the scent of pine. Clara walked down a simple stone path lined with wildflowers, her dress a flowing whisper of ivory that caught the breeze. The twins sat near the front, each holding a tiny basket of petals, giggling as they tried to throw them all at once. Noah's breath caught when he saw her. There were no diamonds, no extravagant decorations, just her, radiant and real, walking toward him like she always had, steady and unafraid. When she reached him, her eyes locked on his, and the noise of the world vanished. The officiant, an older woman with kind eyes, spoke softly. Marriage, she said, is not a contract of perfection but a promise to grow together. It is a daily act of courage, forgiveness, and faith. Noah barely heard the words. His gaze never left Clara's face. He thought of every moment that had led here, the boardrooms, the storm, the hospital, the quiet nights when fear whispered louder than love. And now, standing beneath the open sky, he realized that everything painful, everything uncertain, had been leading to this one, perfect moment. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was low but steady. I've spent my life building walls, he said, because I thought safety came from control. Then you walked into my world and tore them down with kindness. You taught me that love isn't something you own. It's something you give away freely every day, even when it scares you. You made me brave, Clara. You made me believe in something bigger than success. Clara's eyes glistened as she replied, her voice trembling slightly. You once told me you didn't know how to stop performing. But the truth is you never had to perform for me. I saw the man underneath, the one who felt deeply, who wanted to build something lasting. And now we have. You gave me a home, Noah. Not the walls, not the view. You. You are my home. The officiant smiled. You may kiss the bride. The crowd faded to a blur as Noah cupped her face and kissed her, the softest brush of lips that carried years of forgiveness, grief, and rebirth. The guests cheered. Eli clapped his tiny hands and Sophia squealed, scattering the last of her petals into the air. Later, as dusk fell and the sky turned amber, Noah and Clara sat together on the terrace, the twins curled asleep in their laps. Lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, their light reflecting in Clara's eyes. Do you ever miss it? She asked quietly. The power, the noise, the chase? He smiled faintly, looking down at his children. No, he said. I used to think power meant control. But this... He brushed a lock of hair from Sophia's cheek, his voice softening. This is power, the kind that changes you from the inside out. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, sighing contentedly. Then we're exactly where we're meant to be. The stars emerged one by one, scattered like promises across the velvet sky. Noah tightened his arm around her, feeling her heartbeat sync with his, and as the night deepened around them, he finally understood what it meant to have everything. It wasn't the empire, the wealth, or even the triumph. It was the quiet certainty that he'd found the people who would love him when all of that was gone. He closed his eyes, listening to the twins' soft breaths, and smiled. For the first time in his life, Noah Redgrave didn't dream of the world. The world was already in his arms,